Hey guys, it's Daniel. Peter Grant is one of the most influential managers in the history of rock and roll. He was one of the key factors behind Led Zeppelin's major success, and often went about his business in some very unconventional ways, including physical violence if he felt necessary. In this video, I'm going to show you a clip from my interview with Led Zeppelin III engineer Terry Manning, where he discusses some interesting stories about Peter Grant, including one that involves a gun. According to Terry, Peter Grant was actually a very nice guy, but when it came to Zeppelin's business, he could definitely turn on the heat if he felt necessary. Later in this video, I'm also going to read to you a biography of Peter Grant, but first, here's a Terry Manning clip. If you want to see my full Led Zeppelin III interview with Terry Manning, where he discusses some of the stories behind Since I've Been Loving You, Immigrant Song, and the making of the record, the link is available below. When it comes to Zeppelin, a lot of people consider Peter Grant like the fifth member of the band, so to speak, right? What was Peter Grant like? Like was he a very aggressive person from what I understand? Like how was he to be around?
Around me and the band and whatever, he was a total sweetheart. He was like a great big teddy bear. He had been an ex-professional wrestler.
Yeah.
Big guy, very strong, very he could intimidate you if he wanted to, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But no, just working day to day, he was a lovely man. I really, really liked him. He was so devoted to the band. I mean, he really saw them not as his kids because they were too old for that, but really as a family. And he took care of them like I've never seen a manager take care of a band. He really, really loved them deeply. And of course, they were being so successful. Mm-hmm. You love that too, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But I have seen him in, I went to many concerts over the years, probably close to 50 or maybe even more than 50 Zeppelin shows live. And when he needed to be, like on one show, he saw what he thought were microphones out in the aisles of one of the shows. I think this may have been Baltimore. There were a tripod set up and something that looked like microphones out there. And he was furious. Somebody was recording Zeppelin from the show. So he charged out into there, grabbed the equipment, picked it up, threw it against the wall, smashed it all up. It turned out it was some scientists doing tests of levels during sound check to see how loud a band was or something.
Yeah.
But he could literally pick people up and throw them around. And I've seen him do things like that because he was taking care of the band. But so, yeah, he was two sides of him, very tough and aggressive when he had to be, but just a total sweetheart when you were there in private.
Do you remember first meeting him?
First meeting him. Wow. Oh, gosh. I don't remember if it was at a show, if there was a show first, because he was not at the Yardbird shows that I'm talking about before, even though he did manage them at one point, I believe. But he wasn't at those shows. But so it either would have been at the first pickup at the airport when they came for the very first between shows recording and mixing thing, or I might have gone to a show before that and met him. I honestly don't remember though, but I'm like, he was much taller than that. I'm like 140 pounds. He's like 280 pounds or something. Big man. So if he wanted to just use that girth and bulk and intimidate somebody, he could certainly do it. But lovely man to me from the very first. Hearty handshake and a big hug, and off we went.
That's so cool. Do you have any one memory of him that sticks out to you?
Well, the one I just mentioned of smashing up the equipment from the scientists. Another time backstage, some people had sneaked in backstage, and I think this might have been in Dallas or Fort Worth, but he caught them with some cameras skulking around, and because he didn't allow any cameras, any recordings, anything of the band that wasn't controlled by the band. And I saw him actually pick people up and throw them out the back door. So those kind of things stick in your head. But I don't want to make it sound like he was a big tough ogre. He was only doing the things he needed to do as a manager, and he had the power to do it.
Was he a funny guy?
Oh, he could be very funny. Very, very smart man. Very funny. Very astute at business things. He did all the contracts. He took care of everything between the band and the label, and really, really watched over things like a mother hen.
Hmm. That's so cool. So when Jimmy Page approached you to do the mixing and mastering for Zeppelin III, did you have to go through Peter Grant to get it officially contracted or something?
There was no contract or anything. It was all just let's go to work and do it. There certainly wasn't a contract. It was all just part of the family, part of your friend, helping your friends out, you know.
That's so cool, man. So, what's the craziest thing you've experienced with Peter Grant?
I do remember an after show experience that was amazing. They played in Memphis, where I happened to live at the time and work. I was there backstage before the show, but there was a lot of press stuff going on and pictures and things being done. And then they played the show. During the show itself, the crowd went absolutely berserk. Weren't sitting and watching. They weren't just standing and watching. The almost entire crowd had stood up on the seats, and they were just pounding their feet, standing on the chairs. And this was during A Whole Lot of Love near the end of the show, and it was just insanity. Well, the manager of the Coliseum where they were playing, the Mid-South Coliseum, a man named, believe it or not, Bubba Bland, was the manager. And he was furious. You were tearing up my place, you stupid hippie kids in the audience. So he literally, and I hate that word literally, I hear it all the time when people don't mean literally. But in this case, in actuality, the manager pulled a gun on Peter Grant and pointed it at him and said, I want you to stop this show or there's going to be real trouble. And it was just, what?
That's
so
crazy.
Peter got Robert's attention. So you've got to calm down, calm everything down. This is getting out of hand. There's actually a gun back here and it's not good. Now, just 3 days before, their limousine had been shot between Dallas and Fort Worth, and a bullet had gone through the limousine. So Robert, everybody calm down, bring the music down soft, bring it down low, whatever. And they really, whispering A Whole Lot of Love. And everybody calmed down. They turned the lights on in the Coliseum. He said, I want everyone to sit down. We've got to finish this show. We're having trouble back here with the people of the facility, so let's please calm it down.
Wow.
And everybody sat down and all, and then they came back full, and everybody's right back up screaming. It was just so exciting, unbelievably good.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the thing, I was backstage in the dressing room with only Peter Grant, the 4 band members, and me in this dressing room backstage. And I just said, guys, I've got to apologize for the city of Memphis, for the state of Tennessee, for the Coliseum. This wasn't what most people would do. This one man was just over the top. Please accept my apology for everything. They said, we're never playing here again. And we're just furious. So I just couldn't believe it. So that was sort of a special backstage experience. Then after that, Jimmy, the rest of the band left, and Jimmy, I had this gigantic Mercedes 300 limousine I had bought that somebody had, and I just couldn't help but buy it. So it was I think it had been a United Nations car at one time. It had a back seat that was as big as you could live in it. It was huge. So Jimmy had let me get a pass to pull that inside the Coliseum at the backstage area.
Yeah.
So we went out, and I got in the car. Jimmy got in the car, and his girlfriend Charlotte got in the car, and my wife at the time. And I drove him to my apartment where I had an Indian dinner all set up. We had a late night dinner. I knew he loved Indian food, and you couldn't get it out and tour in the U.S. So I'd had an Indian people I knew make a beautiful dinner, everything. But fans saw the car leaving, and they just, that's Jimmy Page in there. And they were following us down streets, and I was driving as fast as I could.
Oh, man.
And swerving around. It's like a movie chase, trying to get away. And finally we got to my apartment, and we ran inside and locked the door. And what a night. Anyway.
That is amazing. So I gotta ask you though, the guy with the gun, what ended up happening with him when the crowd re-erupted?
He was unhappy. He basically, I don't know at that point, I was running for backstage. I didn't see the further things that happened. I didn't want anywhere near any of that. Uh, but a shot was not fired. I know that.
That's good.
And the show ended, and it was very, very bad scene, though.
Jeez. It's funny because I would imagine that Peter Grant would typically be the one kind of pushing somebody around, so to speak, instead of getting pushed around.
Not with a gun in someone's hand.
Oh, man.
He was too smart for that.
That's hilarious. So, I mean, do you have any, like, just on that topic, is there any one Peter Grant moment you saw where you were like, whoa, like, this guy is just really going crazy here?
There was one. I don't know if I could tell it.
Okay.
It's
up to you, man.
Ooh, it's a bit rude in some ways.
Okay, it's up to you. Whatever you're comfortable with.
I saw him in a restaurant restaurant at the Hyatt House on Sunset.
Okay.
That people called the Riot House.
Yeah.
In the little coffee shop in the morning, the band was all still asleep, but I was up and Peter was up. He said, "Come on down for coffee, whatever, tea." So we're sitting there, and a particular promoter was there.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter was arguing with him that he had cheated them on the figures. The promoter will do a show and then bring you the figures and give you your money. And he said, "You charge for this and you shouldn't, blah, 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 blah." And the guy was arguing back. The waitress brought up cups of hot tea.
Okay.
Just boiling hot, literally almost boiling, literally. I said it again. Almost boiling water.
Yeah.
And Peter stood up, looked at the guy, opened a part of his trousers.
Oh, geez.
And placed a part of his anatomy in the hot cup of tea.
Oh, man.
And looked straight in the eye and just left it there and looked straight in the eye of the promoter. And the promoter said, "I give up. You're right. Here's your other money."
Wow.
It's hard to say it without saying words I really wouldn't normally be saying in public.
That's crazy.
But hopefully that gets the gist of it. But he did it for the band. He was wanting to, you think you're tough? Here's tough. And that's pretty tough.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think that would qualify as tough, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
When you were there just seeing this, how do you react in a situation like that?
I just keep quiet, sit there and drink my tea. Nobody drank that tea, by the way.
That's funny, man. Did you have a relationship with Peter Grant before working on this record?
Just a minor one, but we really got close during that.
That's cool, man.
I loved him. I loved that man. He was a really, really wonderful guy.
That's awesome.
And to see him in action out on the backstage shows and taking care of business, wow.
That's so cool.
It was good.
Yeah. Was he very hands-on, like, not like physically, I mean, like, was he very, like, around you during the mixing process, or did he kind of give you your space?
Definitely giving space. Jimmy was hands-on on everything. He was very much the producer in every capacity on this. He was really, really, I just was astounded by his musical brilliance and technical brilliance, always, every song. But Peter would sit back and, I mean, he wouldn't dare to contradict Jimmy in musically or anything. He knew Jimmy was the guy. That was the bread and butter for the band right there. He was the man. So yeah, he just would say, "That sounds great, guys. Keep going."
That's awesome. Hey guys, the following is a biography of Peter Grant. This is from the book Guns, Cash, and Rock and Roll, The Managers by Steve Overbury. Quote, "It was Peter Grant and Jimmy Page who had pulled Led Zeppelin together from its desperate scraps. John Paul Jones, an old session-playing pal, Robert Plant, rescued from a no-hopper bummy band called Hopsweedle, John Bonham, an ex-bricklayer who preferred to stay in Tim Rose's backing band until he was talked out of it. It was to be Grant who booked the gigs and financed them. It was Grant who negotiated the revolutionary deals that were to see Zeppelin earning more from gigs than any of their predecessors. It was Grant who got them the tough deal with Atlantic Records that not only left the record executives weeping, but also sent their earnings from records off the graph and the band into tax exile. It was also Grant and his henchman, Richard Cole, who fiercely protected the band members from the gun-totting crazies and the revenge-filed police chiefs, from the rabid fans and crooked promoters, and from each other. Zeppelin wielded phenomenal power over fans, adoring record executives, groupies, dealers, and hotel staff alike. Its members were used to getting exactly what they wanted, when they wanted it, all eased by a spew of dollars in the face of which most cheerfully succumbed to the caprice of the Zepp machine and turned blind eyes to the fallout. But it was the overarching influence of the giant ex-wrestler Peter Grant and his exercise in what might be called full contact management that imbued the band that astonishing level of arrogant self-belief, the absolute conviction that they were the greatest rock band ever. Grant was born in South London in 1935. Details of his childhood are sketchy, but it is thought that his mother was Jewish. He never knew his father. Like others in this book, he performed poorly at school and was cursed with a report saying, "This boy will never make anything of his life." Peter must have taken some pleasure in this when he was being driven to five-star hotels in six-door limousines, or perhaps he acquired yet another expensive antique for his moated country house. Like Don Arden, Grant left school in his early teens. He suffered a job in a sheet metal factory, waited on tables, ran around town as a messenger boy, and worked as a stagehand at the Croydon Empire before being called up to the army. After 2 years of national service, he was promoted to the rank of corporal and given charge of the soldiers' canteen, where he arranged shows for the troops. He knew by then that entertainment was his thing, and after the army he found work first at a holiday camp and then at a hotel in Jersey. Measuring over 6 feet tall, Grant's next step was to be the key to his future and his fortune. Acting as the doorman bouncer in a coffee bar in Soho doesn't, on the face of it, seem like a major career development. But this was no ordinary coffee bar. This was the Two Eyes Coffee Bar at 59 Old Compton Street, and from these humble premises would spring the first British skiffle bands. Lonnie Donegan played there. Adam Faith sang there. Tommy Steele was to be discovered at the Two Eyes, and Harry Webb and the Drifters, soon to be known as Cliff Richard and the Shadows, did some of their earliest gigs there. Above the Two Eyes door was a neon sign immodestly declaring the world-famous Two Eyes Coffee Bar, home of the stars. And it was true. 2 Australian wrestlers had taken over the lease in 1956, and after letting a few bands rehearse in the basement, they started booking them in. Coffee bars had become popular in the 50s after the first trickles of intrepid British holidaymakers had begun to venture abroad after the war. They returned excited with stories of delicious food, wine, and coffee, at a time when Britain still languished under the deprivation of rationing. Coffee bars became associated with a sense of cosmopolitan style and exotic continent. But you couldn't have a coffee bar without a coffee maker. Achilles Gaggia filed for a patent for his espresso maker in Milan in 1948, and the machine started appearing in London around 1952. The first bars were opened by enterprising Italians in Soho and were immediately popular with teenagers who didn't want to hang out with old ladies in tea rooms but were too young to go to the pubs. The Two Eyes was one of the early adopters of Gaggia's creation. It boasted an American jukebox as well as one of the chic espresso machines, and downstairs was the tiny basement that came to be decorated with murals by Leon Bart, then a young silk screen printer. It was soon brimming night and day with teenagers, including a young Barbara Windsor, and even a younger Mark Bolan. Larry Parnes used to trawl the place, spotting young talented men. Gradually, it became a hangout for aspiring pop performers. The waiter at the Two Eyes was a youthful Mickey Most, who'd already seen success playing gigs in South Africa and who occasionally doubled as one of the Two Eyes acts. He and Grant became firm friends. By this stage, Tom Littlewood had taken over the bar and he was paying Grant £1 a night to sell the tickets for the basement gigs. He kept back 10% for commission and paid the bands at the same basis. The giant Grant's presence in a tiny coffee bar couldn't be ignored, and he soon came to the attention of the manager of the cellar, Paul Lincoln, who was a wrestler. Lincoln found Grant some extramural work as the Masked Marauder, a 23-stone giant who would take on all comers, though Peter was less than enamored with his wrestling stint, once glumly referring to his image as that of a bodyguard in a harem. But it's clear that the finger-pointing, puffing out the chest tactics that wrestlers employed then and now were to become invaluable to him later on when it came to extracting Led Zeppelin's fees from recalcitrant American promoters. Somewhat fortunately for Zeppelin, Grant wasn't entirely enthralled by the dubious glamour of all-in wrestling and quit the ring. But it wasn't to be for rock band management, not yet anyways. First, Peter Grant was going to be an actor. He had some blink-and-you'll-miss-it parts on TV in The Saint, Cracker Jack, The Benny Hill Show, and Dixon of Dock Green. And his movie roles were even less auspicious. He was once employed as Anthony Quinn's body double in The Guns of Navarone, and was a Macedonian guard in Cleopatra alongside Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, although this part sadly found its way to the cutting room floor. Acting went the way of wrestling, and it was Grant's plan to find a more secure earning that sowed the seeds of all that was to come. He bought a van, which he used to take variety acts around the circuit. This was a defining moment. There are those who aver that this was Peter's métier, his real calling. He'd become a roadie, and that's, to some extent, what he remained, albeit a Rolls-Royce version. In time, Grant was to become the biggest roadie of the biggest band in the world. But it was as a humble apprentice that he was to cross the path of the godfather of rock, Don Arden. In 1963, I got my first big break, he said. That's when I started working for Don Arden, from whom I learned a lot. He brought Bo Diddley over to Britain, and I was his tour manager. Arden saw the obvious advantages of having on the team a fearsome, bearded man with a van who could also handle himself in a tight situation. If there was a check to be collected, Don said, I had to make him aware that sometimes the promise of a check was broken. Mickey Most added, Grant always made sure a contract was honored, and he had a very good head for figures. Peter became tour manager to all of the visiting American stars that Arden was bringing over, and carried out the twin function of driver and bagman. As well as Bo Diddley, he began to look after the Everly brothers, Chuck Berry, and the troubled Gene Vincent. After smashing up his leg in a motorcycle accident, Vincent's boozing increased with the pain, and despite the brilliance of his performances, he was a nasty drunk and getting nastier. He bullied all around him, save for his new tour manager, who apparently used to grab Vincent by the throat and push him on stage when necessary. In Chris Welch's book, Peter Grant, the Man Who Led Zeppelin, he tells the hilarious story of Vincent arguing with his wife on the tour bus. They had started hitting each other, and Grant had to separate them twice. A surly Vincent, who had secreted a bottle of vodka, sulkily swigged most of it back and lurched to his feet, in the process mangling his good leg between the handrail and the seat. Grant came to his aid by bending the bar back like a circus strongman, but the damage was done and Vincent couldn't stand up. Grant was determined the show would go on, not for the sake of the fans, but because the contract stated that if the show was cancelled, then no fee would be paid. The compere stood in front of the drawn curtains and announced, Ladies and gentlemen, all the way from America, the king of rock and roll, Mr. Gene Vincent. When the curtains were opened, Vincent was upright, strapped to a microphone stand. He managed to launch into the first song but only got as far as bebop before he fell forward on his face. The star's nose was splattered and he was knocked unconscious, covered in blood. Two roadies carried Vincent off stage, Welch says, like a pig on a spit. But Grant didn't care. He nipped in and grabbed the cash already. The star had come out, although it was almost immediately extinguished, but the contract had been fulfilled. Peter was starting to develop the skills that would hold him in such good stead later. He ran gigs by the notorious Chuck Berry. Eric Burden of the Animals claimed in his book, I Used to Be an Animal, But I'm Alright Now, to have once seen Peter and Don on all fours poking pound notes under Berry's dressing room door, beseeching him to open up. The star would not go out on stage or even open the door without first being paid. Burton later worked with Grant, and when he took over the tour management of the Animals, as a consequence, Grant was to work once more with Mickey Most, who had by now begun getting production work, including that of the Animals' worldwide hit record, House of the Rising Sun. He and Mickey Most were occasional partners now, as Grant took over the tour management for the Nashville Teens. Most produced their hit record, Tobacco Road. Grant figured he was ready for a proper band management position now. That was where the money was, but first he needed an office. Most needed one too. So the fledgling muso entrepreneur started sharing some space in London's Oxford Street, where they sat facing each other, banging the phones and promoting their records and acts. After a couple of flops, it was to be a novelty song that gave Grant his first big hit band. It was also to lead him to Richard Cole, the man who was to ride shotgun with the big man on his mad bulldozer rock business rampage. The new vaudeville band were basically a bunch of session men dressed up in candy strip jackets. They knocked off a catchy song called Winchester Cathedral, featuring vocals sung through a megaphone. For some reason, the Americans loved it, and the track went to #1 over there, giving Grant valuable experience of guiding a band through the cabaret clubs of Las Vegas. Ex-boxer and scaffolder Richard Cole had been a roadie for a series of acts including The Who, when he found Peter Grant, who needed someone to help him with the new vaudeville band. The two impressed each other, as Cole recollects in his book, Stairway to Heaven. Wages were agreed, but the deal was only concluded when Peter waved his finger at Cole, saying, "If you ever repeat anything you hear in this office, I'll cut your ears off." Cole says he replied, "If you're going to point your finger at me much longer, I'm going to bite it off." It was a marriage made somewhere, but not in heaven. The Most Grant partnership had set up shop at 155 Oxford Street, a building which itself has become a mini legend. Chris Wright and Terry Ellis were already ensconced there, running Chrysalis Records with their bands Jethro Tull and 10 Years After. The company's booking agents shared the floor. They were joined by Billy Harry, a friend of John Lennon, who had come down from Liverpool to be a music journalist. Harry was to become the publicist for the new vaudeville band and later for Led Zeppelin. A creative nucleus had been forged, and there was cross-pollination floor to floor. Peter had become very ambitious, not least because his tiny wife Gloria liked nice things. He needed an act that would start big and grow. Mickey Most had just hooked up with the Yardbirds, a band with supergroup potential who couldn't quite get it together. Although it featured Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page in its lineup, it was heading into meltdown. Manager Simon Napier Bell was about to throw in the towel. In his book, Black Vinyl and White Powder, Napier Bell says he and Jimmy Page didn't get along. When he told Peter Grant that the band was a bloody nuisance, he got the response, "Oh, I could deal with them. I just hang them out of the first floor window." The creed, according to Grant's surrogate father and music business mentor Don Arden, had been now passed down to the next generation of rock manager. The threat of being hung out a window by your feet had become the first resort in negotiation tactics. Peter toured with the Yardbirds. The band's bass player Chris Drea recalled seeing Grant in full flow when they were late for a gig in Canada. These two mafioso guys with their veins popping in their necks were going to kill us. Peter was sitting in the back of the bus and they pulled guns. They actually pulled a pistol on him. I'll never forget this, but he got up and barreled them away with his stomach. He said, "You gonna do what?" And they were so taken aback that someone had the nerve to do this, they just ended up laughing. It broke the ice, but it was quite something to take a pistol in the stomach. He had guts, all right. It wasn't the last time he faced down a gunman equipped with nothing but a huge belly. Even a 5-star tour manager like Peter couldn't prevent the Yardbirds giving up the ghost, knackered and riven by two big guitar egos. Said Chris Drea, "We were working 500 days a year, and in those days you didn't travel in executive jets. It was a hard slog. We just burned out, basically. We should have come off the road and thought about doing another album. We were in perpetual motion and it finished us off in the end. Also, Jimmy Page and I were more on the heavier side of music at the time, and I think Keith Relf, the vocalist, and Jimmy McCarty, the drummer, understandably for them perhaps, wanted to go a more mellow route." Grant and Page crawled from the wreckage, somehow clutching in their possession the name the Yardbirds. In a remarkable sleight of hand, Grant had convinced the original band members to sign over the name to him and the parvenu Page. They would build their own supergroup from the ground up under the Yardbirds' mantle. This looked like a good proposition. The new band would have a well-known name and some hits in its portfolio. It had a hard-nut manager and so far possessed one bona fide guitar hero in the making. Drea stuck it out for a bit, but John Paul Jones, an old session-playing mate of Jimmy's, was soon drafted in to replace him on bass. What they needed next was a singer and a drummer. Robert Plant had been bumming around the Midlands with various slim chance acts. He looked great. He had a hugely powerful voice. He shared Page's fondness for hard blues, and he happened to know a phenomenally loud drummer named John Bonham. What a package. The band signed, sealed, and delivered. Grant and Page were very tight with each other. It was an interesting and complex relationship, which variously saw Page playing master to Grant's servant, and Grant in the role of father to Page as son. Whatever the truth may be, at these early stages in 1968, they were the dynamic hub of the new band, and in musical terms, whatever Page wanted, Grant got for him, as Bonham was to find out in the rehearsals. Page had asked him to make his drum parts a bit simpler, but Bonham kept whacking away regardless, and Page became quietly annoyed. But Grant didn't do quiet. "Do you like your job in the band?" he thundered. When Bonham replied in the affirmative, Grant warned, "Well, do as this man says, or you'll disappear through different doors." The name The New Yardbirds had done its temporary job. It had attracted press attention and made the task of getting gigs for the new band easier, but ultimately it proved cumbersome. The new band was flexing its muscles and was ready for a fresh start. When The Who's Keith Moon, once considered a potential candidate for the drum stool, joked that the new band would go down like a lead balloon, and Who bassist the late John Entwistle pointed out it would be more like a Led Zeppelin, Grant had found the perfect name for his perfect project. Yet, what a different project it might have been. Prior to Robert Plant's recruitment, there had been speculation that perhaps the small face's Steve Marriott might have made a good vocalist for the seminal Zeppelin, until an unattributable message came to Jimmy Page from Marriott's management. "How would you like to play guitar with broken fingers? You will be if you don't stay away from Stevie." Could this have been a warning from the desk of Don Arden direct to the heart of the camp of his protege Peter Grant? Even Peter didn't have the stomach to tangle with Arden. Grant took the renamed band on a tour of Scandinavia where they were well received, then into the studio where they bashed out the tracks that were to be the first Zeppelin album. It took a mere 30 hours. In all things musical, Grant habitually took a back seat and was content for the players to play in any way they thought fit. However, when the band sat talking about what they might release as their first single, Grant stepped in and made his considerable presence felt. Zeppelin would not be issuing any singles, ever. He saw that a new band was invariably judged on its first release, and if that flopped, then so did the band. The rationale was that if the band didn't release a single, then the single couldn't possibly flop. The record companies naturally regarded this as commercial suicide, but in time they were forced to concede to Grant's strategy, coupled with his new view that Zeppelin would do few, if any, interviews. He felt the band expressed itself most eloquently through its music. It was a marketing masterstroke. Top of the Pops, so long the omnipotent arbiter of what was hot and what was not in the UK, had for once been spurned. Zeppelin, by refusing to make singles, had daringly raised two fingers to the BBC. There were few other TV shows that catered for heavy rock bands in those days. Ready Steady Go had ceased 2 years earlier, so effectively, Zeppelin had snubbed television altogether. And because the band refused to cozy up to reporters, the newspapers and magazines, starved of copy, were given to writing yards of hyperbole and speculation about the band's activities, private lives, and motives. The more unavailable Zeppelin were, the more the punters and the editors slavered after them. Billy Harry, Zeppelin's British PR, observed Grant's tactics when he attended the band's gig at the Newport Jazz Festival in July of '69. My job basically as a PR was to keep the press away. Peter wasn't interested in the band doing interviews. He might let some of the underground magazines talk to them like friends. He wasn't even interested in having them on TV. He wanted to make them superstars that nobody could get near, rather like movie stars today. But in those days, pop stars would do anything for publicity. Peter just wasn't interested. Treat them mean and keep them keen was the order of the day. An air of mystery grew up around Zeppelin. They were a myth before they started. Peter Grant rarely missed a gig, but on the 19th of December 1968, while Zeppelin were playing the Exeter City Hall for £125, Grant was on a plane to New York to see Ahmet Ertegun at Atlantic Records. He would emerge with an advance of $200,000, a figure commonly held to be the biggest advance ever paid to a new band up to that time. Ertegun already liked the tapes, but curiously, it might have been the queen of white soul, Dusty Springfield, who helped to swing the deal, since she had worked with Jimmy and John Paul Jones in their session playing days and recommended them to the Atlantic bosses. Peter had pulled off a tough negotiation with a respected label. He had a hot band and a hot album in the can. The only way now was up. A week after the Exeter City Hall gig, Zeppelin were supporting Vanilla Fudge and MC5 in Denver. Over the next 3 months, they gigged hard and worked the first album into the charts at number 10. The American press started to get excited about this third wave of the British invasion. And Zeppelin were excited about the USA too. America was their element. It's unlikely any band has ever assaulted the hearts, minds, and pockets of American youth with quite the vigor that Zeppelin did. They traveled further, gigged longer, and partied harder, thus ensuring their status in the history books as the biggest and best monsters of rock. The troops in Vietnam rode jeeps into battle while playing Whole Lotta Love on their tape players. Back home, Zeppelin fans bought $5 million worth of albums. There were 700,000 advance sales for Led Zeppelin II. The album knocked the Beatles' Abbey Road from the top slot. The band members and Grant started looking around for country houses. Girls crawled over one another to get to the young rock stars. Drug dealers queued up to show their wares. There were bars to drink dry, there were hotel rooms to wreck, there were limos to abuse. There was a huge bag of cash to help smooth the ruffled feathers of officialdom, and if things got tricky, there was also the band's small personal army of bodyguards and road crew to beat off unwanted attention. The band's legendary after-show hijinks originated with drummer John Bonham, who, according to Richard Cole, Bonzo used to say to me it was impossible to come back to the hotel after a performance and sip tea or hot chocolate and watch the telly. After flailing at the drums with the force of an atom bomb, Bonzo literally needed hours to calm down and unwind. "I'm too hyper," he would complain, tapping his foot, scratching at his arms. "I gotta let loose and blow off some steam." The trail of carnage that was to ensue involved more than just the regulation telly out-the-window caper. Cole figured out that in one gargantuan drinking session, for example, the band, himself and Grant, drank 120 Silvovits and 160 beers in only 4 hours. Grant's bagman, Cole, was paying for it all by now. He took the job of keeping the band amused on stage and off with considerable verve, and like some lunatic court jester, laid on the laughs while unwittingly, of course, helping to set a course which would ultimately see the great Zeppelin finally spin out of control. Amidst all this muscular hedonism and chaos, a towering Grant, dressed perhaps in light blue kimono and a purple gocho hat with blue plume, on his fingers a selection of silver rings, some embedded with turquoise, the very rock of roll, would smile down at his precocious progeny like some benign bearded Buddha. But it was only those inside the Zeppelin camp, to those he protected, that he radiated confidence and security. To those who opposed him, or those he considered on the make, he could be a rude, ruthless, intimidating bully. Good luck to you if you attempted to make an illicit recording of any of the band's performances, for example. At a concert in Vancouver in 1970, Grant spotted a man with a tape recorder. In Stairway to Heaven, Cole wrote, "Peter growled, 'He's right out in the open, what a fool.' Some members of the crew and I stormed over, grabbed the fellow by the shirt collar, lifted him to his feet and shouted, 'You can't do that here. If you want a recording, go to the record store and buy one like everybody else.' The man was hoisted into the air and dropped in a heap onto the floor. We grabbed the recorder and smashed it against the security barricade, shattering it into a dozen pieces. It turned out the man was from the Vancouver City Noise Department, and he was taking decibel levels. Grant coughed up cash and damages. An enraged Bonham then smashed up a hotel room and Grant was forced to cough up again. Later that year, a band called Flock were to feel the wrath of Grant when they wouldn't vacate the stage at the Bath Festival. Peter simply led his gang of roadies onto the stage and started unplugging all their gear mid-performance. "Hey, we haven't finished yet, man," said a Flock roadie. "Oh yes, you have," yelled Peter. Stephen Davis says in Hammer of the Gods that Richard Cole punched the roadie and that Grant threw a few punches as well and quickly got his band on stage via brute force. He'd done something right. That gig broke them into the big time in the UK. They were now up there with the Stones, the Beatles, and the Who. Peter set up more tours of the States, and attentive as ever to finance, he dreamed up a new deal which many agree fundamentally changed the gig business. The traditional procedure was that the promoter would split the ticket money with the band on a 60-40% basis. In the case of a big Zeppelin gig, which might gross $50,000, the promoter might pick up a cool $20,000 for one night's work. Grant wasn't having it. He told promoters that the split was going to be 90-10 from now on. They were outraged. They threatened, they fumed, and they yelled. But eventually they gave in. They needed Zeppelin more than Zeppelin needed them. "I remember Grant talking to Bill Graham, who had the biggest venues in rock," said Mickey Most. He'd say to him, "It's 90-10 or you don't get Zeppelin." I'd be sitting there listening to the conversation and the phone would ring again. I'd hear Bill Graham say, "How about 80-20? "What? Are you deaf? It's 90-10. He'd put the phone down. Then Bill would phone back. "Okay, you got a deal." Then it became normal practice. Everyone now does that. Peter Grant started it. In September of 1970, Zeppelin did 2 gigs at New York's Madison Square Garden and grossed more than £100,000 for each. Led Zeppelin III had advance orders of $700,000 in the US, and Her Majesty's government wanted to bestow the band the Queen's Award for Industry, something Grant thought too pro-establishment to accept. Peter's profile was now such that there was speculation that he was to take over the management of another, then mega British band, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Melody Maker ran a cartoon of Grant as a huge whale with 2 bands, Jonah-like, inside him. A geyser of banknotes gushed from the whale's blowhole. Grant was furious and directed an onslaught against the paper, which nervously printed an apology. But his fury may have had more to do with the depiction of him as a whale than any projected takeover. Managing Led Zeppelin was extremely demanding, and Peter was in bad way. Stressed out, smoking heavily, and extremely overweight. He had to book 2 seats for himself on airplanes and often crushed chairs and toilet bowls. But if he was big, then his band was bigger. Zeppelin shared a label with the Rolling Stones, who were, and still are, frequently called the greatest rock and roll band in the world. What was a little unknown outside the business was that Zeppelin were outselling them by 3-1. Zeppelin were the biggest band in the world, bar none. Led Zeppelin were now living by a different set of rules to mere mortals, as Richard Cole eloquently explained. Once we started our momentum, the people knew that we didn't give a damn. The doors had to open now. If they didn't, we'd break them down. We made our own laws. When the band arrived to tour in Japan, Immigrant's song was number 1 in the charts and the audience response verged on hysteria. At the end of one show, the screams of the audience still ringing in their ears, an elated band steaming on Japanese whiskey resumed their offstage pranks. One episode of tomfoolery in particular awoke the wrath of Grant. It was supposed to be an ambush on Jimmy Page by the other band members, but it was a badly aimed shot. They chucked a vile mash of cold tea, sake, and rice over a sleeping Grant. The vengeful Grant rose behemoth-like from his bed and boxed John Paul Jones around the ears before punching Robert Plant in the mouth. Richard Cole appeared, and Grant made to punch him out too. Cole ducked, and the fist connected with John Bonham. Grant bawled Cole out and sacked him on the spot, wrongly thinking for once that he had been the instigator of the attack. An accompanying Japanese minder witnessed 3/4 of the biggest band in the world being beaten up by their own manager and was not unreasonably appalled, thinking that he had just witnessed the band's breakup. He had to be assured that this was just another regular night of fun for Led Zeppelin. At a gig in Lyon, Peter witnessed rowdy elements of the crowd knocking over elderly ticket staff as they attempted to get in for free. Grant's roadie army was dispatched to deal with it. Benoit Gauthier, the record company representative in France, recalls, "They weren't afraid to fight. That's how it was with Peter. If something's unfair, he gets furious. I would say he could be furious enough to actually kill someone because he's so strong and he is big. But he's fair and his word meant something." At the next gig in Nantes, as he waited to get through a locked gate to the backstage area, Grant's Mercedes was surrounded by fans. Thinking the band in danger, he revved up the car and rammed through the gates, taking off the car's bumpers in the process. Reliable album sales figures are hard to find, but there was a lot of common agreement that Zeppelin IV was the 4th biggest selling album of all time. Behind the Eagles' Their Greatest Hits 1971-75 at number 1, Michael Jackson's Thriller at number 2, and another British band, Pink Floyd's The Wall, at number 3. Zeppelin IV contained Stairway to Heaven. An 8-minute epid beloved of students of a certain age everywhere, and which most would identify as the definitive Zeppelin track. These were Zeppelin's peak years. Post-Stairway to Heaven sales would gently decline, but from such a high starting point that they were still selling many millions. The Financial Times predicted that Zeppelin would make $30 million in 1973. Concert attendances were still breaking all records. On yet another American tour, the band returned to the Edgewater Inn in Seattle, scene of the well-known Mudshark story. All the TV sets were thrown into the sea below. Resignedly, Peter went to reception to pay the bill for damages only to have the desk clerk say he'd always wanted to throw a TV set out the window. Have one on us. Grant is said to have growled before handing over an additional $500. The clerk promptly lived his dream and dropped a huge TV from the balcony to the watery grave below. Zeppelin may have earned bundles, but clearly their overheads were massive. Perhaps it was these frightening outgoings that drove Peter to conceive of more and more innovative methods of wringing yet more money out of the system for his merry band of brothers. He figured that the band should have their own label. The Beatles had Apple, the Stones had Rolling Stones records, even Elton John had Rocket Records. The name Swan Song was chosen. The new band would distribute Zeppelin material and also other bands they favored, such as Bad Company, Maggie Bell, and The Pretty Things. Grant turned down the job of managing Queen. Offices and staff were taken on. Grant asked his publicist to arrange the launch at a Manhattan restaurant and put in a request for some swans to be placed in the chic establishment's small pool. It seems swans weren't that easy to get a hold of in New York, but the resourceful organizer managed to find some geese. Grant was wrathful. "Do you think we can't tell the difference between swans and geese?" he raged at the employee. In 1975, Zeppelin played a string of gigs at Earl's Court. The 85,000 tickets were sold out in hours. This turned out to be something of a swan song for the band, although they didn't know it at the time. They were forced into tax exile shortly afterwards, and would play only 2 more UK gigs ever. In Rhodes that year, Robert Plant was involved in a car crash. His wife was seriously injured, and he was to be wheelchair bound for months. Tours were cancelled. After Plant's recovery, the band recorded Presence. The album went straight to the top, but all was not well in the Zeppelin camp. During the layoff, Bonham, Page, and Richard Cole were having heroin trouble, and Grant's marriage was breaking up. One day, Cole says post-separation, Grant's wife had gone with a male companion to Peter's moated country house to collect some belongings, and Peter had phoned Cole to come down help deal with the situation. Cole rushed to his master's aid, as he had many times before. "I went to an upstairs bedroom," he says, "collected 2 guns, put them in the trunk of my car, and drove to Peter's house." In the event, no violence ensued, but there is little doubt that Cole had been ready to use the weapons should his master have called for it. Guns, heroin. Things were getting a little out of hand. Alan Callan, who ran Swan Song and often traveled with the band, saw Grant in action on many occasions. However, he says he never saw Peter use violence. He never had to. When Grant had once gone to the hospital because of an arm injury, says Callan, the doctor said to him, "Mr. Grant, do you use your hand in your work a lot?" "No, but I do use a lot of this," he said, and prodded the doctor to his chest. Only Peter would talk to a doctor like that. On most occasions, the big man's mere presence was enough to swing an argument, Callan says. Peter was able to achieve all kinds of things by employing his remarkable persona, and that included that terrible stare of his. If he decided to stand up and move a bit closer to you, he could intimidate you with his body language. And yet it seems that everybody who really got close to him or had dealings with him found he had this extraordinary charm. He had such a great sense of humor, absolutely fantastic. Grant would often regale dinner guests with tales from the tours. One of his favorites concerned the time he sat on Elvis's father. The band had seen Elvis Presley play in Las Vegas and were invited backstage. "I suffer from a lot of back trouble," Peter said. "I was talking to Ronnie Tutt and his wife. Ronnie was Elvis's drummer. Behind me was a long couch, and I said to Ronnie, 'I've got to sit down because my back's hurting.' I sat down and realized I had landed on somebody's legs. I jumped up and looked around and realized it was Vernon Presley in the white suit. I said, 'I'm really sorry, Mr. Presley, for sitting on you, but I guess if anybody is going to do that in this room, it's got to be me.' An embarrassed Grant left, saying to Elvis, 'I've got to apologize for sitting on your dad.' He looked me straight in the eye," Grant would tell his audience, and said, "Stick around, kid, you might get a permanent job." It may have been this encounter that led Colonel Tom Parker to contact Grant early in 1977 to see if he would manage a tour of Europe by Presley, but Elvis died in August of that year, just as negotiations had begun. Despite the humor, there was a sickness at the heart of Led Zeppelin. The band were getting an increasing number of death threats to the extent that at one time they seriously considered wearing bulletproof vests on stage. Grant became increasingly paranoid, a condition exacerbated by his new appetite for cocaine. His wife Gloria had left him for one of Grant's own farm workers, saying that Peter loved Jimmy Page more than her. Alan Callan's marriage folded and Richard Cole's marriage was also on the rocks. Back in the States, the band were still playing to huge audiences, But there was a kind of wind of change back home. The Sex Pistols emerged kicking and spitting onto the scene, and they had what they considered to be the dinosaurs of rock in their sights. There were other troubles too. Bonham and Cole were in a posh restaurant in the south of France when Bonham produced a gas gun and wouldn't put it away. Cole broke Bonham's nose in an effort to shut him up. Too late, the police arrived and the pair were locked up, but miraculously, the gas gun was never found. The remarkably slack police also somehow missed their pockets full of cocaine. Cole and Bonham were released without charge. When Zeppelin flew to New York for the premiere of their troubled movie, The Song Remains the Same, Cole threw a switchblade at someone on the plane. Later, he swung a punch at a Melody Maker writer and was thrown out of a restaurant. He appeared the following day with marks on his face, and the rumor was that Peter had slapped him around as a reward for his errant behavior. The 1977 tour was not the triumphal rush of earlier times. Cole said, "I think that Grant's separation from his wife was really the end of everything. It's funny, but I hated that last tour. You could feel it. Something very bad. It was all the drugs. I don't know. But there was something wrong. It wasn't the same." The adulation was greater than ever, though, despite Jimmy Page's rather eccentric choice of a stormtrooper's uniform for one of the shows. They played a gig in Michigan to 76,000 people, and at the end, Richard Cole picked up a check for $800,000. Having a private army that lived on lots of drink and drugs was bound to cause big trouble at some point. And that point eventually came during the band's 1977 American tour. Grant had employed actor hardman John Bindon to help out with Zeppelin security. Bindon was a major player in one of the nastiest and well-documented scenes of violence in the Zeppelin story. Grant's 11-year-old son, Warren, accompanied his father to a gig in Oakland and had been seen attempting to take a souvenir Zeppelin sign from a backstage caravan door. The story goes that one of the promoter Bill Graham's guards clipped Warren round the ear, and John Bonham, having witnessed the event, kicked the guard in the balls. This wasn't enough for Grant. He wanted retribution. While Richard Cole kept guard, he and Bindon attacked the guard inside a caravan. The man was badly beaten. The incident was to lead to the arrest of Cole, Bindon, Grant, and John Bonham, who were all charged and led away in handcuffs. They were found guilty and all given suspended sentences. It seemed there had been scuffles earlier that day. During that afternoon, Bindon had hit one of Graham's stage crew, causing his head to strike some concrete. Grant had hit another. Incensed, 3 of the crew issued an action lawsuit for $2 million in damages against the defendants in a case that was to drag on for months. Then came the news that Robert Plant's son had died of a viral infection. Plant flew straight home, the tour was cancelled, and the infamously bad-tempered gig was to be their last in the USA. Bill Graham later wrote in his book, Bill Graham Presents My Life Inside Rockin' Out, how much he liked the band, but not the machine that surrounded them. I didn't like those people, he said. I didn't like their influence on society or their power. Back then, Zeppelin were kings of the world. They surrounded themselves with physical might, and they were ready to kill at the slightest provocation. Robert Plant said of the gig, "It was an absolute shambles. It was so sad that I would be expected to go on and sing Stairway to Heaven. People know how I feel about that song. I had to sing it in the shadow of the fact that the artillery that we carried with us was prowling around backstage with a hell of an attitude. It was a coming together of those two dark forces, which had nothing to do with the songs that Page and I were trying to churn out." John Bindon, whose colorful life included acting stints in Performance, Quadrophenia, and The Sweeney, as well as holidays with his girlfriend, model Vicky Hodge, in The Mustique, where he claimed to have charmed Princess Margaret, was later to stand trial for murder. The deceased Johnny Dark was a well-known gangland figure. It was alleged that Bindon had stabbed him to death in a contract killing. Bindon admitted to stabbing Dark, but said it was self-defense. He stood trial at the Old Bailey and was acquitted, partly as a result of actor Bob Hoskins' testimony as a character witness. Strangely, Bindon once won a Queen's Award for bravery, having rescued a drowning man from the Thames, though it is alleged that Bindon had boasted that he pushed the man in the water in the first place after the two had a fight. His acting days over, Bindon died from AIDS alone and broke. These were troubled times. Grant retired to his estate, the band were off the road, the label needed constant attention. Peter was fighting a custody battle for his children, and his doctor ordered him to lose 10 stone urgently. Months later, the band, bloodied but unbowed, were ready to record and gig again, but Peter had begun to use heroin. Cole worked at the Swan Song offices for a while, but when he wasn't on the road with the band, then he was only really interested in drugs. The violence hadn't stopped. He and Bindon had beaten up a dealer. Not amused, Grant gave his henchman a job as tour manager with another band to get him out of the way. He also thought Cole was too involved with heroin. Soon after, a truculent Cole was sacked altogether by his now enraged boss. Cole went off to Italy to clean up, but ended up in prison. A paranoid Cole alleged Grant fitted him up via an ex-CIA friend. He served 2 months and then was released with no charge. The band did a short European tour, but 2 months later, John Bonham was found dead. He'd succumbed to the old rock star death, drinking 40 measures of vodka in 12 hours and choking on his own vomit. The glorious flight of Zeppelin was over. Grant became a recluse, hiding away behind the walls of his castle with one of Cole's ex-girlfriends, and he stayed that way for years. Perhaps the only man who could have brought him out of his seclusion was Jimmy Page, but Page had problems of his own, and the incredibly close partnership that had created the band in the first place was no more. In the wilderness years, Page and Grant lost contact. Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren, who once harbored plans to make a film about Grant, gives a summary. Grant needed the camaraderie of hard, dangerous men who gave him a sense of power. The harder they were, the tougher he felt, and only then was his desire for control satisfied. It all fell apart when Grant aped the lifestyle of Jimmy Page, who then ostracized his biggest fan. Later in life, Grant finally lost the weight that had so plagued him. He kicked the coke and the smack and seemed to reach a more contented state. He'd managed to keep custody of his children, which had provided him with some stability. He maintained his low profile, sold the mansion, and opted for an apartment in Eastbourne. He was by now a grandfather. Grant even returned to acting. He had a role as a cardinal in Carry on Columbus. Peter re-established contact with the remaining Zeppelin members and his industry friends and was inducted into the British Music Roll of Honor. He died aged 60 from a heart attack. The guest list at his funeral indicated the level of respect he'd maintained to the last. Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, Paul Rogers, Simon Kirke, Denny Lane, and Jeff Beck all paid tribute to Peter the Great.